Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters. And for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the Safe Camp Audio Network. Check out our show page and all of Safe Camp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org, on the web at Safe Camp Audio, on all social media. On today's episode, Natalece Washington, Policy Counsel for the National Association of Counsel for Children, joins us to talk about her organization's campaign to get all 50 states to guarantee legal counsel to every child in foster care. Before we get to Natalece, let's hit some headlines for the week, which I'm going to keep brief on account of two things. My getting a very annoying head cold makes my voice even less magnificent than it already traditionally is. And we're also doing a little short-term foster for a very cute dog here named Carmen in our household, who likes to play and get pets every second of the day. So it's very hard to kind of break away from her this weekend to record. All right, so let's do some headlines. This week, we will focus on a few things going on Capitol Hill, or have already gone on Capitol Hill. One briefing, one hearing, and one wonky but fairly significant development around the Family First Prevention Services Act. So first up, we had a congressional briefing. It was held in conjunction with the Congressional Social Work Caucus and hosted by a group that calls itself Repeal CAPTA. It's actually a coalition of several organizations. But despite that name, the subject of the briefing was the impact of family support on child safety, right-sizing CAPTA funding to better protect children. And CAPTA is, of course, the acronym for the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, passed in the 1970s. And it includes two not so enormous pots of money that go out to states. One of those is the Community-Based Child Abuse Prevention Program, which is a pretty general support grant. It goes out to states. I think there's a little bit of a match requirement from states to get it. And it enables them to do things to prevent maltreatment, really on a broad kind of population level if they want. And, as the name suggests, this is money that can be distributed to community actors and organizations to do the work. There's not this requirement that the courts get the money to spend or the child welfare agencies spend it or contract with even their foster care providers or anything like that. It really is a general use thing. It's often referred to, if you hear people say CBCAP, that's the acronym, Community-Based Child Abuse Prevention. Now, the other pot of money within CAPTA is connected with helping pay for more of the systemic aspects of child welfare, including, surveillance through reporting, investigations of maltreatment, prosecution of maltreatment cases. And that pot is tied to some strings, including that states have some regime of mandated reporting where professionals, are bound by law to call in any suspected abuse or neglect that they observe or are concerned about. In some states, I believe it's 13 states, they're actually every single person or every single adult is a mandated reporter. So the state grant pot that I just referred to with the strings attached is $105 million as of last year, fiscal year 2023. And the community funds are for $71 million. So that was what it was last year. So the thrust of this hearing, and I will, I'm reducing an hour plus of conversation into a few words of description here, but I will link to the whole conversation if anybody wants to check it out. It was basically America this is the argument of the panel that was put together to do this briefing. America is over-surveilling families, particularly families of color. There's mounting evidence that more material support and community supports can help prevent families from ever coming into the orbit of child welfare. And thus, let's take this cumulative amount of money that goes out to states under the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act and put it all into community grants. So whereas the coalition that calls itself Repeal CAPTA, really, I guess the more technical kind of approach, or at least as professed in this briefing, is they would like to repeal Title I of CAPTA, take that money and put it into the title that really just goes out to help communities, support families. So this all happens in the context of CAPTA has, as I mentioned, was passed in the mid-70s. It has not been reauthorized since 2015, so it is, we're coming up on almost a decade overdue for reauthorization. You might think if you don't follow this stuff all that much, well, something didn't get reauthorized in time, then the money goes away. That is true in some cases with mandatory spending. But when it comes to discretionary stuff like the money that goes out the door through CAPTA, members of Congress can still write the stuff in even if it hasn't been reauthorized. And that's been the case. CAPTA has been funded all these years since 2015. It's overdue in the sense of having the, legislation, and often in the process of reauthorizing, members of Congress will update a law. They will tweak it. This just happened with the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, which also went almost a decade unreauthorized. And then when they finally got around to it in, I think, 2018 or 19, it had a whole bunch of different changes and additions to it. So anyway, that's all to say it hasn't been reauthorized. It is due for reauthorization. So in that sense, there is room for changing it. Hence, a briefing calling for changes to be made. On the other hand, it has been a few years where there have been incremental kind of marches towards an eventual reauthorization of CAPTA, and this proposal, if it was taken seriously, which would require some, I think, at a bare minimum, some of the more influential people on the social work caucus to take it, put a bill in the place, and get some people with some juice on the kind of relevant committees that have jurisdiction on CAPTA to really consider this. This would constitute kind of blowing up a lot of the, more incremental changes that have been proposed to CAPTA. And not all of them are incremental. It's kind of worth noting that, recent iterations of the CAPTA reauthorization have included, first off, big increases in the authorized spending. So I think in one recent one, I believe it was like more than $500 million that was proposed, and that was kind of evenly split between the Title I money for the systems and, for the community-based CB cap. And, that first part of the law, that also includes the requirements around mandated reporting and all that. On the Senate side, the proposed reauthorization of CAPTA has recently included proposals to require, for the first time, that attorneys are provided to both kids and parents in child welfare cases. That is not constitutionally required for both of these people, these groups, to have a lawyer, nor would this make it an absolute mandated requirement for all states. But if you wanted to get your CAPTA money, the proposal that was on the table in the Senate would require that you're showing in your state plans, basically, that you are providing an attorney on both sides to both the kids and the parents in child welfare cases, which is a big deal. But anyway, I think safe to say there's going to be very little new legislating done anytime in this calendar year with everything that's going on Capitol Hill in terms of just getting, first off, a Speaker of the House, which just happened, but getting the government not to shut down, figuring out what they're going to do in terms of spending for the war in Ukraine and what's going on in Israel and Palestine. So good chance that, anything happening around reauthorization of CAPTA will be something that will unfurl in 2024. But you never know. I mean, the Family First Prevention Services Act was probably the biggest change in child welfare policy in, 20 years. And that got passed as part of like a continuation of spending. It just was like part of a bill that kept the government open. So there is always that chance that something slides through pretty quickly. I guess we'll keep our eyes on it, of course, at the imprint. Now, the hearing last week was truly one of the stranger ones that I have seen in covering child welfare and youth justice in Congress. It was held by the Senate Judiciary Committee's Subcommittee on Human Rights and the Law, which is not a body that typically convenes on child welfare issues. They don't have jurisdiction on the big federal, laws and programs that kind of relate to child welfare, in particular Title IV-E, which has billions of dollars of funding involved in it and things like that. But it's not totally out of the realm of possibility that a subcommittee from Judiciary would want to look at human rights as regards to foster care. The real weirdness comes in the fact that it was a hearing that was part of the subcommittee's ongoing, and I'm quoting kind of from their material, ongoing bipartisan investigation into the treatment of foster children in the United States. But so far, this investigation has only included a look at the state from which the subcommittee's chair, John Ossoff, comes from, and that is Georgia. So the subcommittee's investigation started in the winter of 2023 after some local media coverage in Georgia sort of lifted up the fact that Georgia's child welfare agency was really struggling to find, safe, stable placements for particularly older youth with high needs in their foster care system, and they were leaving them or placing them into hotels at a very costly rate per day for the agency. And this was referred to in the story as hoteling, which kind of caught on and became a big thing in Georgia. Even though I would add, it is certainly a problem. It's not a problem endemic to Georgia by any means. If you're a close reader of the imprint, you know that we've written about this happening in all kinds of places around the country. Washington State, California, Texas has had an enormous problem at points in the last few years with children living without placements in offices or hotels and whatnot. Okay, so this story comes out, and then not long after that, this subcommittee announces an investigation. At the time, the subcommittee staff confirmed to us at the imprint that Georgia, was currently, at the time, and I think this was in February, the only state that was being probed. And the letter states that the subcommittee is, the letter announcing this investigation back then, quote, conducting a review of matters related to children's safety and well-being in foster care. It doesn't really specify Georgia would be the only state of interest. As we learned at this hearing, the subcommittee staff have interviewed 100 plus people in this investigation, reviewed thousands of documents and records, and it has all been about Georgia thus far. And the hearing was also only about Georgia. We heard from at this hearing a mother whose child died in foster care. The child actually was in the custody of a non-custodial parent, and the father's girlfriend was involved in the death and is now in prison for it. We heard from a teenager about her struggles while in the foster care system in Georgia, including an instance in which she was placed in a juvenile justice hold. She was in jail after being arrested. The detention center or wherever was ready to release her, and because the child welfare agency was not able, and this is her account of this, able to find her a placement, they basically instructed the detention center to keep her for another, I think, a couple of weeks or so, because they didn't want to assume the risk of the bond. Eventually she got out, of course, but a pretty awful tale to hear. We also heard from, two professors who are also involved in kind of clinic work in Georgia about some of the systemic problems. So we heard a lot of things about this one state in this and the problems from the point of investigations in Georgia all the way to the treatment of, teenagers who are facing entering adulthood from the foster care system. Okay, so that was last week, and since that hearing, Senator Ossoff has held a press conference on findings from this investigation into what's going on in Georgia. The week this podcast is coming out, the subcommittee is holding a field hearing called Foster Children and the Courts, which is taking place in Georgia, at Georgia State, and the witnesses will be 3 county judges from Georgia. I think what I'm getting at here is that this, thus far, has been a national, congressional investigation into the human rights of foster youth and the experience of foster youth from a human rights perspective, looking at only one state, which is just weird for, a proceeding on a national level. I think it was accentuated also at the hearing last week because the ranking minority member of the Subcommittee on Human Rights is Marsha Blackburn. She is a senator from Tennessee, or one of them. She basically very quickly glossed over having inquired into, different aspects of the foster care system in her state in Tennessee, and basically just said, she heard back several months later from the commissioner that things were going great and that there were really exciting programs. No doubt there are some good things, I'm sure, going on in Tennessee. There's probably some very good things going on in Georgia. There's probably some very interesting and compelling programs and people serving youth in foster care and helping parents. But I think it just kind of accentuated that it's hard to know where this is going, if it's really going to just stick to being a congressional committee looking at this one state. So, we have not yet heard from Senator Ossoff's office. We've certainly asked them for some information on just sort of what the broader plan is for this investigation and whether or not they'll be looking into things. And I think to kind of draw this back to like a purpose standpoint, if this subcommittee is going to attempt to craft legislation, it will be national legislation. It will be something that applies to every state. It just is very peculiar. It would be very odd to do that based on this extremely deep dive into the practices of one state. So I think, where I'm at is just kind of very fascinated by the trajectory thus far, and I guess we'll see where it goes from here. Because as indicated at the hearing, this is an ongoing investigation, and the record is going to stay open. So we'll keep watching. All right, last thing for this week, the Biden administration issued a call for comments through the Federal Register around how to improve or change the clearinghouse process that is used to determine what programs and service models are approved for spending under the Family First Prevention Services Act. And so I'm not going to go into a huge tutorial on this, but passed in 2018, the Family First Prevention Services Act, most people just call it Family First Act, on the front end of the system opens up the Title 4E entitlement, which used to be only for foster care and adoption payments, for services that are aimed at preventing the use of foster care. It's not prevention of maltreatment. It is prevention of using foster care when maltreatment has been kind of acknowledged through, substantiation, or a youth has been deemed, to be at imminent risk of entering foster care. So it's kind of I don't even know what to call it, what we're calling secondary prevention versus tertiary or whatever it is. Okay, so why this is important, I got a little bit of a lowdown on this because I was surprised when it came out. There was actually already a call for public input on the clearinghouse. A lot of people have been frustrated with, first, the speed at which the clearinghouse was reviewing things. There is some concern around how opaque the process is. You don't really get a lot of feedback from them. You just sort of get acknowledgement that a program didn't meet criteria, or it did. Some programs are getting reviewed, and the people who basically are in charge of, fidelity to that program or to developing the program didn't even know. So there was already this call for feedback. What I've been told is that in the last round of this, there were plenty of comments calling for kind of a shift in the way that, the clearinghouse took an approach to considering and reviewing different programs, including, especially the way that cultural adaptations of programs, or programs specifically targeting or serving, Native American, Black, Latino youth and families were rated. And those comments were basically ignored because it wasn't seen to have been within the scope of what the review is for, if that makes sense. So the first time they called out, hey, we want to hear from the public about this process. What are your problems? What are your concerns? The scope of that was just procedural, like the really wonky stuff about how you would interpret an evaluation, different things like that. I think the biggest thing that came out of it was they changed like baseline equivalence. I don't know this stuff. I am not a researcher. But that was sort of what they were looking for. So that all took place. I believe the call out was before the changeover in administration. So it was during Trump that the first call for feedback on the clearinghouse started. President Biden issued an executive order, I believe on his first day in office or sometime very close to that I'll link to for, people who want to actually read it. Basically, it instructs the White House to work with the executive branch agencies, including the Department of Health and Human Services, to examine where there might be room to make federal programs and operations more racially equitable. So that was kind of seen to be a very broad mandate to go and review and scrutinize, any federal program, including the Family First Act and the related clearinghouse to it, to see if there are ways in which we are not being equitable or could be more. So I do think they'll get a lot of the same comments and probably some more ones this time around, how they might differently consider and evaluate, maybe a tribal program that was developed and is not backed by some entity that's got the deep pockets and contacts and ability to do some enormous, long-running randomized control trial, but has, significant evidence from a community perspective of its value. I think you'll also probably see some folks start to push for them to widen the scope of what could be considered under kind of the four categories of like allowable things in the Family First Act. And those are parenting support, substance abuse treatment, mental health interventions, as well as supporting kinship navigator programs. So I think you'll probably see some comments submitted to the feds that are arguing for especially material support, serving people's concrete needs, even housing programs, as things that could be considered and reviewed by the Clearinghouse. I know that there was one group, and I will probably write about this. I've sort of seen some of the presentation from a conference where this was kind of first indicated, but I know there's kind of a group that want to make the case that, just simply concrete needs as a program should be considered by the Clearinghouse. And if that was actually the case and they got approved, just something generally saying, concrete needs, that would enable states to tap into, a federal match of money to kind of do more things with just providing, fiscal supports or other concrete supports to families to, prevent the situations that can lead to foster care. So a little bit wonky, but ultimately kind of a big deal, especially if we see the rules change a little bit to be a little bit more generous and considerate of kind of unique programs that serve, the African American or Latino, Native American communities, and consideration of more things than just purely teaching a parent about parenting or the substance abuse, mental health, and kinship supports. All right. When we come back, our interview with Natalece Washington.
Today's Imprint Weekly podcast is brought to you by Accenture. Change is afoot in child welfare. Change that means agencies focus on results for children and keep far more of them safe at home with their own families. Accenture's child welfare team is leading the way in the effort to ensure technology does its part in that success story. Accenture offers cutting-edge case management tools that ensure agencies can see insights that drive decision-making and caseworkers have information they need at their fingertips. Together, these tools help agencies stay laser-focused, reinventing child welfare into a source of strength for families when they need it. For more information, visit www.accenture.com/child-welfare.
All right, we are joined today by Natalece Washington, Policy Counsel for the National Association of Counsel for Children, to talk a little child representation and the lack thereof in several states. So Natalece, thank you for joining us on the Imprint Weekly podcast.
Thank you for having me. So excited to share with your audience today.
And this is, I should say from the outset, the first time I've interviewed somebody in person for this podcast. So I appreciate Natalece being my guinea pig of sorts for that. I've never done it. I think it'll be more fun.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah. So house rules on this podcast, they got to get to know you first a little bit before we get into all the serious stuff. So I'm going to make you give me at least one favorite. Here are the categories.
Oh, goodness. Okay.
Book, TV, movie, sports team, or musical group. You only have to give me one. You can give me more than one if you want.
Okay.
What do you
I've got two things for you.
Yeah.
I just saw Beyonce last week, and she has solidified that she's my favorite performer, artist, entertainer. And my favorite book is The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna, set in World War II. Just an excellent, epic novel that I think everyone should have to read.
Nightingale.
The Nightingale.
I'm going to write it down. How was Beyonce? Where did you see her? You're in Atlanta. You're in Atlantan.
Well, she's in Atlanta while I am at the NACC National Conference. So I saw her in D.C. last weekend.
You did it. You went to the D.C. shows.
I went to the D.C. show that made it to TikTok and all news outlets because of the horrible storm that came through and the sheltering in place.
What was that like?
It was not fun, but people were in good spirits. They were excited to see Beyonce. So, I think everyone just kind of sucked it up, and we went about it with a positive attitude, and we were determined to have a good time.
This summer with these tours is insane with her and Taylor Swift and Pink. My wife and my mom are going to see Pink. That's right.
Yeah. So she's coming here. They were just talking about that recently. So it's a good summer for music.
Pretty cool.
But it's also, we're competing with bad weathers.
And you eventually got out of the parking lot. I know from my time in D.C., getting in and out of where the football team plays. I don't even know what they're called anymore. Commanders.
Yes. The parking lot, getting to it and leaving from it were the most challenging parts of the evening.
Yeah. Best song live?
Best song live. I mean, I'm an old school Beyonce fan, and she started off with one of my favorites, Dangerously in Love. So it kind of set the tone for me.
Very cool. Very cool. Glad you got to see her and all her greatness. Okay, let's start with just like the basics and not assume that people are going to listen to this are totally versed in child representation. When a kid becomes involved in a child welfare case, particularly if they've been removed and put in foster care, most states guarantee that a lawyer represents them. Somebody represents them.
That is correct.
I think people generally understand the counsel for parents, right? Because it's a close proxy to defending an accused criminal. Somebody is being accused of doing something wrong. They're going to get a lawyer. What is the child's lawyer's obligations? Like, how does that differ from how most of us think about legal representation? What are they there to do?
Well, I like that you brought that up because I want people to start thinking more along the same lines as they do for parents, as they will with children. So let me say that a different way. Children suffer similar liberty interest deprivation as the parents do. So parents lose their kids. What do kids lose? Kids lose their homes. Kids lose their parents. Kids lose their siblings, their belongings, their schools. They lose a lot of autonomy. So I say this to make it as clear as possible. Kids have legal rights that need legal representation just as parents do. And the child attorney's obligation is to protect those rights, to offer legal counsel and advice, to help kids understand a very complicated, complex system. Just another note here, every adult wants to go to court with a lawyer. No one wants to go to court by themselves. Court is confusing. You don't know the procedures and processes. The judge is typically terrifying. You're not sure when you can talk. And when you are allowed to talk, you're not sure what you should say. All those same things that apply to adults also apply to children. At NACC, we believe and have believed for years since our inception that every child should have quality legal representation.
Yeah, it is like one of the more nerve-wracking or like scary things you can do. It's terrifying. Like appear in court and be expected to talk. I just believe this is totally not nearly as consequential, but I just remember the only time I've ever had to do it was like I was involved with a bankruptcy proceeding, and I got there without a lawyer. And I've done this. I regularly moderate and publicly speak, and I've like hosted trivia. I've talked in public so many times. My hands were shaking.
Yeah.
I was just nervous, and nothing was really at stake for me. You know, I mean, so just, yeah. So.
Traffic court is like the perfect example. Many of your listeners, I'm sure, have gotten a traffic ticket, a parking ticket, and they've had to appear in court, and things are happening, and you have no idea, and you're like, oh, this was just a traffic ticket. I'm not going to retain an attorney. And then you get there and have no clue what's happening, when you should talk, whether you should plead nolo, what do I do? Yeah. I don't want points on my license, all the things. But again, that's why you want a skilled professional to guide you through the process.
Yeah. Totally. And am I correct in saying is that one huge difference between representing kids and representing parents or any other type of representation is kids is a very broad concept. There's obviously a very big difference when you're going into court and your client is 3 months old or 7 years old. So they kind of know what's going on, or they actually quite 7-year-olds really know what the time is. And then teenagers who, ostensibly can think for themselves and articulate a lot about what they want to see. So, like, how does that vary? I mean, you've had this experience, right? I
have represented children across the developmental stages. Yeah. And attorneys, first of all, are governed by rules of professional conduct. Sure. So any attorney is expected to understand how to represent someone with diminished capacity. So no one would ever say that a disabled person who couldn't speak to them should not have legal counsel or was less deserving of legal representation. And so, yes, there is a way and a method to representing a nonverbal infant, which does look different than representation of a teenager or a school-age child. And those rules are governed by the rules of professional conduct, and the ABA has published guidance related to methods of representation for nonverbal substituted judgment is what we're calling it. NACC adopts that same standard representation for children who are very young and nonverbal. So there are definitely means to protect the legal interests of children across developmental stages.
Not to go too far down that rabbit hole, but like, what is sort of the best practice when it's really just a toddler who can't talk to you about developing, a sense of what you're going to argue for that child in court?
Yeah. So first of all, it's really about developing an understanding of that client's life and experience. So I know you're saying a client, a 3-year-old. Yes, let's call that child what they are. They're my client. Yeah. So my role as the attorney is to conduct a full-blown investigation. I want to know where that child lives. I want to know their family. I want to know their siblings. I want to know their health and developmental abilities or inabilities. I want to know everything comprehensively about that child so that I can understand what I'm advocating for while they're in foster care. Because the role of the attorney is multifaceted. I'm advocating for permanency for that child. I want them to be reunified with their families, or I want to swiftly seek adoption or guardianship, whatever that case merits. But I also want to make sure that child is safe, healthy, and well while they're in foster care. And so I'm visiting the foster home regularly. I'm ensuring that that child's dental, medical needs are met. If there's an immigration issue at play, if there's all sorts of issues, school disciplinary issues, if there's medical, if there's any medical fragility and we need to make sure that their follow-ups and special needs are being met. So the role of the attorney is really to cover all those bases. And how we do it is by stepping into the shoes of the child and trying to determine what that child would want if they could talk to us. And we do that through this mechanism of investigation where we're talking to collaterals. We're talking to the service providers that service that child, whether they're health, mental health, collaterals, neighbors, pre-K school teachers, anybody who has awareness of that child and could speak to what that child needs or that child's experience in the community that could help inform us. What we do in substituted judgment is different than what we do in a best interest sort of scenario where we kind of look at all of the facts of the case and through our own lens determine what we think is best for that child. The substituted judgment model aims to eliminate that opportunity for bias. And that bias could come through in a best interest determination as we filter information through what we think is best. When we use substituted judgment, we're really aiming to investigate objectively the facts and choose the goals that that child would choose if they could.
So really, NACC kind of advocates for substituted judgment up to the point where, I wanted to drop another term of art here, client-directed becomes a possibility. Like those two, and really not a phase where best interest is the
correct.
The way
so NACC published recommendations in 2021 where we endorse client-directed advocacy. And in that model, substituted judgment is what we use for any child or youth of diminished capacity. So
Gotcha. Which makes sense. I mean, that's so really for the listener that might not be like immersed in these terms. It's like, am I right to say in a substituted judgment approach, you're saying, look, you're going to do one thing or the other in terms of where this child's going to live. I'm here to tell you, like, to some extent, these are the things this child needs or are entitled to, whatever that decision is. Like, you're not, as the attorney, going in there to really focus on, I think they should stay with mom, or I think you should separate them from mom. I'm here to tell you what you owe them anyway. Or is that an overstatement of it?
No, I want to make sure I understand you clearly. I do think that we are looking at the facts and making sure that the goals chosen are what the child would want and stepping out of it. I think that's the part that the attorney has to get, especially as you're changing models, like as someone who has represented children in both a best interest and client-directed manner.
Okay.
I have to make sure that my filter is turned off. I am not synthesizing information to what I think is best, but instead really looking at what that child or youth could want. Am I interviewing their siblings? Am I talking to people who've known them and watched them and seen their bond with their parents? All the things that would inform what that child would want.
Before we talk about states that are not guaranteeing counsel, I had one question about the ones that are. So are there any states, because this is a conversation that has definitely got some energy, at least on the parent counsel side, the idea that, even in the states that guarantee the right to counsel, and that is most of them now for parents, that doesn't cover the fact that a lot of times the counsel is guaranteed well into a case. Like either the child's already been removed or it's right at the time when that's happening. And even in some states where, you're facing a termination before you're guaranteed counsel. on the youth side, on the child side, are there any states that guarantee counsel just at the point where a child welfare case is open, as opposed to like they've already been put into foster care?
So the states that are guaranteeing youth counsel are appointing them at the filing of the petition.
Okay.
That's the general practice for the 36 states that guarantee counsel for all youth in state custody. And so, so we're not dealing with that super delayed appointment into the termination or much later. It's generally at the filing of the petition.
Cool. Okay. So we covered it when you guys did this. We put out a report to kind of kick off this campaign, Seen, Heard, and Represented, a policymaker's guide to counsel for kids. And in it, you identify, or kind of in the supplemental materials, I guess, identify, I thought it was 13, but if I'm doing my math on the fly, you said 36. So is that 14 states that don't have a guaranteed right to counsel?
You're right. I said 36. I should have said 37.
So we're at 37.
Yes.
Okay.
We passed law in Montana, so I'm used to saying 36.
Oh, so that's happened since. Okay.
That's happened since. So it's definitely 37 states guaranteeing and 13 that we're still working in.
Okay. And I'll just tick those off real quick for listeners. It's Alaska, Florida, Hawaii, Idaho, Illinois, Indiana, Maine, Minnesota, New Hampshire, North Dakota, South Carolina, Texas, and Washington. 4 of those states just don't have any right to counsel: Indiana, Illinois, Maine, and New Hampshire. Is there a substantive difference in your mind between the ones that just like straight up don't and the ones that are, I guess, more of a gray area where there's some but not guaranteed?
So the states that you listed do not have any sort of guarantee in their state statutes. The remaining states have a partial guarantee. So, for instance, Washington State guarantees counsel for children 8 and up and to all children after termination of parental rights. So that's Washington. Idaho has a statute that guarantees counsel for children 12 and up. Minnesota has a statute that guarantees counsel for children 10 and up. States like Florida and Alaska have categorical approaches where they will identify in Alaska, it's court rules. In Florida, it's by statute, but they have categories. Like, does the child have a developmental disability, or are they prescribed psychotropic medications? So they kind of bunch youth under categories and guarantee those limited, very narrow categories representation. So that is kind of how we've just determined the 13 states that we need to focus in for our Counsel for Kids campaign.
Right. Okay. So you've got that campaign launched. You're working on the messaging of it. I love, by the way, Natalece, I had to shoot her an email while we were planning this. I love that you're away message while you're here. The standard boilerplate stuff, and then underneath it's like, by the way, did you know that there's 13 states? It's great.
I have to always share the message. People need to know, even when I'm away.
So what is your strategy now? I mean, so you've got it out there, the states are listed, the policy guides out there. What are next steps for you guys as you move towards this? Presumably, I guess part of it is to try and work with legislators to get this on the books.
So Counsel for Kids was launched in 2021, and we immediately did the research to kind of do a full scan of the United States to see where we needed to work. That's how we got our 13 target states. Once we did that, we were already on the ground running in 2021 with statutes passing in North Dakota, in Washington State, and in Arizona. Once we got some momentum going, we came back at it in 2022 and worked in Colorado and in Alaska. And what our work looks like is technical assistance. So with our campaign, we launched a technical assistance application so that state advocates could send some detailed information about the readiness of their state, what policy reform efforts they've made in the past, and approach us to receive help drafting proposal language so they could get help with developing messaging and communications, so that they could get support with developing op-eds. So our technical assistance is really broad, and it's broad in our offerings, but it's narrowly tailored to the state that's requesting it.
Gotcha.
And so that is really how we've gotten to work with coalitions in the state. So part of my work is developing these coalitions of advocates who are interested in the policy reform, because NACC's strategy is not to go into the state and file the bill on our own. Instead, we want to convene advocates who can do their own advocacy with our guidance and support, because I think there's more authenticity when it comes from actual constituents of the state. And it's much easier to approach legislators, get buy-in, and have the ongoing support necessary for the proposal development, then that strategic advocacy, and then ultimately the harder part, the implementation.
So take people like, use Montana as an example if you're comfortable doing that. Like, how did that go down? Take people through how you.
So we're so excited about Montana. Montana passed Senate Bill 148 in the 2023 legislative session, in no small part because of the advocacy of former Representative Danny Tenenbaum and Representative Jennifer Carlson. What happened is that they found NACC's Council for Kids campaign, and they reached out to us over the summer. We'd met them at the National Conference of State Legislators, where we're constantly sending our message to legislators. You've got to improve your systems. Here's an evidence-based strategy to do so. So they found us. They reached out, asked us to participate in some interim committee hearings, to present testimony, to provide information. And that started over the summer. The committee liked what we had to say. They were interested, but the committee would not make it their bill. So, Tenenbaum was rolling off. Carlson was still had some years on her term, and she picked up the baton, and she, with our assistance, got some draft language together, and she proposed her bill. The bill that actually passed was not her bill. It was a companion bill, but she really did the legwork of trying to navigate and educate on Counsel for Kids. Montana is a very large state where attorneys sometimes drive 2 or 3 hours to see their clients. So it was not an easy road. There was a lot of pushback from many stakeholders. I won't begin to list them. And she had to really navigate some harsh critique. We always expect the funding challenges, but some challenges just theoretically that we constantly are having to face as a campaign that she actually experienced. So we were able to give her talking points and research and data and connect her with other states that were in process or had previously passed similar legislation. And so my technical assistance in Montana was directly to a legislator, while in other places that is not the case. That's how it worked in Montana. And hearing after hearing, she fought and educated and, time and time again, let people know that this was evidence-based. This is what has been adopted in most of the states in this country. And this is what children should have because of their legal interest in dependency proceedings. And so that's how we moved forward in Montana. And though her bill did not pass the floor, or it just did not see it all the way, it ended up getting vetoed by the governor. The similar bill with only right to counsel language, Senate Bill 148, passed. And so we got it. And now we're working on implementation, and we're actually working with the Office of the Public Defenders, who are working on training. Oh, I failed to mention something that's super important and what makes Montana a model for many states. Not only did they draft language for the right to counsel, simultaneously, we drafted a bill together that promulgated practice standards and a requirement for the agency to draw down Title IV-E funds. So not only did they have a bill saying, hey, guarantee the right to counsel, but they had a bill that, for all intents and purposes, said, hey, make sure the representation is high quality. So those two things happened at the same time, and that's what we'd like to see in every state.
Yeah, I try to clarify when people drop the child welfare terminology, not at least reference drawing down 4E funds. I want to say 5 years ago, there was a very subtle tweak to the rules around how 4E, which is this big child welfare entitlement, a lot of where most of the federal money, or half of the federal money, comes through. Before this change could not have been used to pay for lawyers for parents or kids. And they just simply turned that tap on and said, yes, you can now draw down, 50% 4E money. So that's huge that was kind of written into the law as you put it in. I'm curious with Montana, what was or really any of these, movements, what do you find is the piece of evidence that people are most receptive of? When you go and say this is evidence-based, if somebody's like, what evidence? Yeah. What's the best one or two that you throw out there and people are like, oh?
Well, I like to lead with youth voice, but it depends on the audience, whether that is well received. I like for impacted populations to speak directly to decision makers and tell them what their experience was without an attorney or how they couldn't imagine an experience without their attorney. I want them to be able to talk about, how they were uninformed. They weren't able to participate in their court hearings. They didn't know what was going on. They had poor outcomes, et cetera, et cetera. And they felt like they could have had an improved experience had they had someone by their side who was responsible, had a professional obligation to them to give them legal advice, to tell them what was happening, and to ensure their engagement in the proceedings. So that is one strategy where we allow the policy development and the advocacy to be led by lived experience experts. So that's one way. Another way is by presentation of research. There is not an expansive amount of research on children's legal representation, but we use what we have and we make sure that people understand it. There was a 6-year federally funded study by the Quality Improvement Center that we often rely on to talk about how important it is for attorneys to be specially trained to improve outcomes for children. Washington State Center for Court Research recently released a study on improved reunification, showed how legal representation improved that reunification and decreased, placement changes and school moves. So those are elements of improved outcomes, well-being outcomes that people always look for.
Yeah, I thought that was a particularly clear, easy one to reference, and pretty ironically that, it was their lack of guarantee to counsel that created essentially a control experiment to produce the numbers that you would need to say to make the case,
Exactly. Yeah. And the last one that we rely on was done by Chapin Hall, I believe, in 2008 in Palm Beach in Florida, where Palm Beach County provides children's legal representation. Yeah. And it studied rate of permanency and the rate towards reunification. And that study shows that the legal counsel expedited permanency. And that's a lot of times what people want to see. And for some legislators, policymakers, they like seeing that expedited permanency because we all know that if a child spends one less day in foster care, that is serious savings because, they spend tens of thousands of dollars annually in foster care, and more for kids who are in locked institutions and high cost facilities.
Also a weird deal in that Palm Beach is often referred to as sort of like a gold standard for how you would do child representation in a state that I just listed on there is not requiring it, right?
Yeah, we have a handful of legal aides who are taking on the lion's share of legal representation in their communities, but we are hoping that the entire state can recognize the value and importance of legal representation.
Yeah. So kind of on that theme, you guys in the report outlined, and I'm assuming share this with legislators, like a model piece of legislation, like here's how we'd recommend you try and get this bill passed. Can you talk through kind of the most critical and crucial parts of that? Like what are the things that are most important? I know you're going to say all of it, but what are the key things to pass if you're going to pass a law to guarantee counsel?
Yeah, we definitely want you to be clear on your role. And so that's why we included it in the Seen, Heard, and Represented. There is an appendix with a model statute. And we think it's very important that you describe what the role of counsel is. And you do that simply by stating that counsel must practice under the rules of professional conduct. Attorneys know what that means. You have a duty of loyalty, a duty of confidentiality, a duty of competency to serving your client. And I think that is one of the primary ways that our statute is clear about the role of counsel in the representation of a child. As I previously mentioned, Montana separately did standards. We heavily advocate that states promulgate standards for attorneys to abide by, but recognize that most won't actually do that in their statutory concept. Many states have practice standards or court rules that are written up and supported by their Supreme Court. And so we don't expect that all the time in statute. But, if Montana is wanting to put it in statute, we're more than happy to see that. But we do think that it's okay to say in statute that attorneys should adhere to practice standards and, those standards just live somewhere else. Also that they have pre-service and ongoing training. It's so important. The right to counsel is nothing without the insurance that counsel is of high quality. well-trained, familiar with a broad range of topics that are relevant to the dependency case and sort of ancillary matters.
Yeah. Yeah. And for anybody listening who's thinking like, oh, Montana, pretty small state, how many kids could it be? The most by rate. It's like it's one of the states with the most youth in foster care. It is certainly a state where it would be extremely important for kids to have counsel. I think one other thing, especially when you're talking about the older youth that we haven't talked about yet, is like we're, thus far been discussing, being in court, advocating for what's going to happen broadly in a case with young people. But it seems to me like these last several years, there have been a lot of different investments made, new ideas being tested in how we support older youth who are in this system and are potentially going to age out of it without the traditional forms of permanency that we envision, reunification, adoption, guardianship, or anything like that. So, basic income, college tuition waivers, the federal stuff under Chafee, all these things. And I think there's an organization called iFoster that does this survey now once a year. And I think what that's really surfaced to me, what was the most surprising finding, was how I think most people would agree they're probably still we're not doing enough to support those youth, but they also don't seem to be aware and being connected to what's even out there. And I think that like one problem that probably exists here is maybe we just assume that social workers or their caseworker are always going to just make sure that they get that stuff, and some will. But I think an attorney there to make sure they know about and are accessing what they're legally entitled to, it's just more important than ever as we continue to augment and hopefully think
Absolutely.
through that stuff,
Yes, the Counsel for Kids campaign definitely advocates and supports bills for attorneys for youth in extended foster care.
Mm-hmm.
So that youth would have hopefully had an attorney up until the time the decision point came about where they had to decide whether they were going to leave foster care or sign themselves into extended foster care. Yeah. And in Georgia this year, my home state, a bill passed for attorneys to be able to continue their representation to extended foster care. Connecticut also had a bill this year on extended foster care legal representation. Absolutely, we believe 100% that if youth are unaware of the rights and opportunities that are available out there for them, if they're not aware of them, they can't access them, and they all go to waste, and the kid does not benefit. The young person does not benefit.
Yeah.
And so they need attorneys to navigate that part of transitioning to adulthood just as much as young people experiencing foster care under the age of 18.
I don't know the percentage off the top of my head, but just like it was below 30% of youth in that survey responded yes to knowing what Chafee education training vouchers were.
Yeah.
How are you going to get it? You don't even know, like nobody told you. You can't, we can't expect kids to know what ETV means. Or, like somebody's got to do that.
And I honestly have never been a fan personally of putting the responsibility on the case manager or the caseworker to fully inform a young person of their rights. A lot of states have statutes where they are saying, we've adopted a youth bill of rights. Mm. It is the state that is responsible for sharing and explaining those rights to the young person. There's quite a few states that have that on the books. Yeah. But if that person is not trained in the law and not familiar with the nuance, how really can we expect them to do a good job explaining that? And, the federal government this year has found that explaining rights to young people is at least worth the importance of writing a resolution. So I think, I don't remember whether they're representatives or senators, but Cleaver and Bacon authored a Foster Youth Bill of Rights resolution recognizing that youth should have rights that should be clear and well-defined and explained to them. So I like that even though it's just, a proposed resolution, that there's some recognition at the federal level that youth have rights and they should be told about them.
Yeah. That would be a start. And to your point, I think obviously if a caseworker is well apprised of those things and knows about them, they should do that. But I think what we've probably learned is that it's foolhardy to assume that's going to happen.
Absolutely.
And the people that are best positioned to know the law and know what people are eligible for are lawyers. And then I think we should be doing much more on top of that I'm bullish on some of these organizations that have really stepped forward and done a lot on raising up youth with lived experience are going to figure out the part of just sort of broad digital, assistance for kids. I really feel like we're probably a couple of years away from somebody being able to go into a portal and being like, I am this age in this state. And it's like, here's all the things you could be getting. Talk to your lawyer about it and go in that direction.
Yeah. And then the lawyer enforcing, because I think that's another piece of it. If the case manager or caseworker brings it up or doesn't bring it up, even in that context, if there's no attorney to hold them accountable for all of the steps that are required, a lot of these things are multi-pronged processes that are difficult. So the attorney, and I've been in that role where you've got to, ask at each step along the way to ensure your client benefits from the full range of the service and the opportunity, because there's so much out there. We like to say the government, we should have more, but the kids transitioning, there is a lot out there for them, and they should get to access every bit of it.
Totally. All right, so like one of these states, if I could be like, wave a magic wand, boom, they have right to counsel. Who is it? Florida? Yeah,
Florida, I think, has been the state that's been working for the longest amount of time and just has a really hard time getting momentum because of just significant opposition down there. Indiana would be my second choice. It's just, we've had 2 legislative sessions with bills being proposed, but bills just dying, lack of understanding. The major opposition that we hear is, what about the developmental capacity? A kid can't tell you what's best for them. They don't know what they want. Or if children are directing counsel, they'll be more unsafe. All things that have not really held water and things that are not issues in other states. Attorneys are trained to represent people of all developmental capacities. That's what lawyering is.
Yeah, right.
We've got to overcome this paternalistic mindset that a young person cannot tell you what's best for them.
That ultimately what they tell you might not end up being what the judge thinks, who's the ultimate decider, but that doesn't mean they don't get to have a mouthpiece.
And we do have to give more responsibility to our judiciary. I think there are great opportunities for best interest advocacy, but ultimately it's the judge's role. And I don't think we could ever overstate that or say it too many times, because people tend to worry, what if there isn't a best interest advocate? Well, there's always the judge.
Yeah.
We can't have the proceeding without them. And that judge is called upon to weigh all of the evidence presented, which can't be comprehensive if the child does not have a legal representative.
So just one thing that you touch on that I want to get clear on is, if there was a state, and Florida made me think of this, if Florida or, one of these states that's listed in your guys' chart as saying that there's non-lawyers can represent kids, if they passed a law that said every child has a right to representation, but don't specify that person has to be a lawyer, that would not count to you guys, right?
No, it's the right to legal counsel.
To a lawyer.
We need to ensure that the child has an attorney-client relationship with a legal professional, somebody licensed by the bar, who has to advise them and guide them and ensure their notice and opportunity to participate in proceedings. Got Nothing short of that.
Gotcha. All right, Natalece Washington of the National Association of Counsel for Children. The campaign is seen, heard, and represented. I will drop a link to the report in the show notes for this episode. Natalece, thank you so much for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks to Natalece Washington, Policy Counsel for the National Association of Counsel for Children, for joining us today. And thank you to Accenture for sponsoring this episode of the Imprint Weekly Podcast. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of the Safe Camp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecampaudio.org on the web or at safecampaudio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christina Anjoko, with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we would greatly appreciate if you consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, very easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews, and visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. You can get us on email at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.